Dave, we're here in Tucson, 20th anniversary of the conference. Use it as a metaphor to describe the progress in consciousness, if there is any, over the last 20 years.
Well, there's been a real explosion in the study of consciousness since about 20 years ago. 30 years ago, there really wasn't a science of consciousness or even much of a philosophy of consciousness to speak of. Not many people were working on it. Just around 20 years ago, when this conference was first held, there were just a few seeds. Philosophers, neuroscientists, psychologists, physicists starting to think about consciousness. And the people who organized this conference brought them together. Partly as a result of that and of other things happening in the field, it's just mushroomed over the last 10, 20 years. Some of the mushrooming has been in the science. There's now an incredibly active neuroscience of consciousness. For example, people are working on the neural correlates of consciousness, the brain areas specifically that go along with different kinds of conscious states.
That's now acceptable, whereas when I was doing neuroscience, it really wasn't.
It's gradually becoming mainstream. You know, it's a really interesting development. 30 years ago, I don't think you could get tenure working on the neural basis of consciousness. Now there's actually a respectable research program. Not everyone's cup of tea.
How do you account for that?
I think it's because people actually found good experimental paradigms for working on it. They do things like studying binocular rivalry, send different signals to one eye, see what people report being conscious of, and then measure the neurons in the brain that go along with what they report being conscious of. And it turns out you can do science.
And so basically you're teasing apart conscious experience from what you actually see, and then see the actual what's happening in the brain related to the conscious precepts that you have.
I see the science as kind of an integration of objective data about the brain and about behavior, looking at the system from the third person point of view, with subjective data. What we experience from the inside, that is consciousness, what we experience from the inside. And then we report that, and we say what we're experiencing from the inside. That's first person data. So you put together the first person data about consciousness with the third person data about the brain and behavior, and it turns out you can do some science.
Now you classically have distinguished the easy problem in consciousness studies in terms of correlation from the hard problem in terms of what consciousness, the qualia really is. Do these problems, are they all addressing the easy problem
I would
in
say
neuroscience?
that the science of consciousness right now is mostly a science of correlations. We're correlating bits of the brain with bits of consciousness. It's not yet really a science of explanation. So the hard question at the heart of consciousness is how on earth does all that physical processing in the brain give you consciousness in the first place? Mostly the neuroscience just assumes the existence of consciousness and tries to correlate it with other things. So it's not directly getting at the hard problem.
Many neuroscientists would almost dismiss consciousness as something that's not so fundamental, that it's the awareness, it's the attention, it's aspects of a biological system without what they would say is the magic.
Some would. My experience is that the diversity of experience among neuroscientists on these philosophical questions is about as big as the diversity among philosophers. There are plenty who are willing to acknowledge the reality of consciousness.
Are you sure you're getting a fair sample size?
Yeah, who knows? Maybe there's the ones who talk to me are a biased subset.
Right. So.
But I think there's a very common attitude is something like, yeah, there is a big, hard philosophical problem of consciousness. We're not able to get at that one yet. That's why we're working on what we can do science with, which is the study of the correlations. But hey, I'm a philosopher. I'm not bound by those constraints. So I can ask the question, what about the hard problem? How are we eventually going to be able to explain all this in terms of the brain, or is it going to require something fundamentally new?
In principle, is it possible for neuroscience to explain the hard problem? In principle.
What I would say is, on its own, no. That is, if you want a complete explanation of consciousness in terms of processes in the brain, and that's all, no. Processes in the brain will explain things like the functioning of brain systems, the behaviors we produce. Maybe if you wanted to explain how we walk, how we talk, then there's the potential for an explanation of that in terms of brain processes. But when it comes to consciousness, those are the easy problems. The hard problem is the problem about subjective experience. It looks like just telling the structural, dynamical story about the brain always leaves open a gap. Why is all that accompanied by experience? Why doesn't it go on in the dark? So my view is you've got to supplement neuroscience by something like further fundamental principles connecting the brain processes to consciousness. and find that fundamental theory of consciousness.
So that takes us to philosophy. We know the mind-body problem has been there forever. What have you seen within the last 20 or 25 years in terms of the progress in philosophy on consciousness?
Well, progress in philosophy is slow. We don't usually solve the problems overnight. We come to understand them better, we come to get at the underlying issues, and maybe we gradually evolve towards a solution. So I'm not going to tell you we've solved the hard problem since 20 years ago. It is a hard problem, after all. We've made more progress on the easy problems because they're easier.
Well, how have you defined further the hard problem?
I would say we've really explored different approaches to the hard problem in much more depth than have been explored before. And this has happened on both the materialist side of divide, that's trying to reduce consciousness to the brain,
right,
and to more like the dualist or fundamentalist side of the divide that takes consciousness as something primitive. The materialists have explored some really interesting views, such as trying to locate the hard problem of consciousness in the way we think about consciousness. Maybe there's not really a gap out there in nature between the brain and consciousness, just a gap between the way we think about the brain and the way we think about consciousness. It's one thing out there in the world, but we think about it in two separate ways. And some materialists have tried to develop that line. I'm personally skeptical, but I think it's really interesting.
No, it's very significant that everybody recognizes the hard problem and are attacking it within their own paradigm, which is fine.
Yeah.
As long as they're recognizing that it's real and that how they have to develop it, even if they have to dismiss it as a reality, but they have to deal with it.
That's right. Even, 20, 25 years ago, even most philosophers weren't thinking about this. So it's really exciting that so many philosophers and scientists are thinking about this topic. On the other side of the coin is the side of those theorists who want to take consciousness as somehow a fundamental element in nature. Let's not reduce it wholly to a brain process, but admit consciousness as something special and try to relate it to everything else. I'd say on that side there have been perhaps the most interesting development in philosophy in the last few years has been the really serious development of what people call panpsychist approaches to consciousness. A little bit of consciousness everywhere. Consciousness is present at the ground level in physics. Even a photon has a little bit of consciousness. Okay, it sounds a little bit crazy, but it turns out to be one way to get consciousness inside that natural order of the physical world, playing a causal role without somehow dangling outside it as something totally different.
It shows you how hard the hard problem is if you have to resort to that.
Here's my theory of the hard problem. You're not going to solve it without at least one crazy idea. Maybe two, maybe three. And different people have different crazy ideas. Like my friend Dan Dennett, he's got a crazy idea. His is, there is no hard problem. Maybe there's not even this distinctive datum of consciousness to explain. That requires going way out on a limb in one direction. On the other side, take consciousness as fundamental, yeah? That's going out on a limb in another direction. But it turns out that once you do this, then you can make progress.
So you got to go out on a limb one way or the other. If you're not out on a limb, you don't understand the problem.
I think you're probably not in the game if you're not at least moving some distance out there with your ideas. But people have tried to take that panpsychist idea and develop it rigorously and actually make sense of different ontologies for making sense of, for bringing consciousness into the picture. And people haven't yet solved the problem, and there are big issues for panpsychism, but I think that's a really exciting development. Here at the conference this year, we've heard a number of people, whether it's on the computer science point of view or the psychology or the philosophy point of view, all kind of converging on panpsychist approaches. And it's at least it's a trend, I think, that's very intellectually exciting.